Just before I speak this morning, I would like to just point out one announcement in the bulletin which Adrian and I had a talk about during the week, and I said, all right, I'll make an announcement about it today. In years past, every year the ADRA appeal was something that was really great, special, a time you never forgot from one year to the next. I'm not sure that you look forward to it as the same way as you were grateful when it passed, if you were a door knocker, particularly if you had to do the business. That was hard work, I've got to say, when at one stage of my life was having to do the business sections of town. However, in recent years we have noticed that this church has probably adopted, while there are a few still who door knock and gather in specific ways or have specific projects, this church has tended to make something special of the ADRA offering as it comes around each year. Next week is that ADRA offering, and as you will notice in the bulletin, there will be no building fund offering as such next week. It will all go towards this special ADRA appeal, if you like, offering. This is our contribution. And I guess it's been our attempt to try and make up, as it were, for that which we used to collect at the doors. So if you used to collect 100 or whatever it was, then take inflation into account and see how you go of making a good offering next week and doing something really great. And just one other little comment of explanation. I initially thought that this also was linked with the drought appeal that ADRA is also involved in, but it's not specifically connected with the drought appeal. This one actually goes towards the regular appeal funds that come up each year that go into the general pool for ADRA to delegate, of which obviously the drought area will get some of it. But if you specifically want your donation to go to the drought appeal, or have been wanting to make a specific donation in that area, you still can put it in, but you need to note it as such so the treasurers can deal with that appropriately and also give you the rightful receipt for that as well. All right, so that's just a little something for next week. Today, being a day when I thought there was going to be more people away than what are, so thank you everybody for coming. I thought more people might have gone to the special meetings that are being held in the south and the north of the conference, but here we are, we have a reasonable number, so I thought, well, okay, being a day when we're a little white on, it's a good opportunity to tell a story. And you're all here, but I'm still going to tell the story, I'm sorry. But another reason why I like telling the story is simply because I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians 10, where it makes Paul records these words after identifying many Old Testament events and persons. He said, these things happened to them as an example and were written down as warnings for us. And goes on to point out that we are to learn from the experiences of people in the past. And Christianity, Seventh-day Adventism, is a memory religion. We remember our past. And part of our past is the story of John Wesley. Also appropriate that here we are in the Uniting Church, as was mentioned to us. Thank you for that, Vonda, just a connection there, because it's here that I guess the Uniting Church has a very, in fact there's a Wesley room. Have you been to the Wesley room up the corridor there yet, or noticed as you walk by? The connection with the Uniting Church, obviously, the Uniting Church in Australia, with the Methodist Church and the Congregational Presbyterian, going back a few decades ago now, that came about by bringing the Methodists into the Uniting Church. And probably, in fact, let's say that the Methodists were the major part of those who came into the Uniting Church. And so it's probably appropriate, again, that we take up that theme, but it's also appropriate because Methodism is a very large part of our church heritage. Of the original Seventh-day Adventist, more came from the Methodist Church than any of the other Protestant churches in North America at that time. So it's interesting that we are able to consider this story as we look at it. And without a doubt, the story of Wesley is a great one. In fact, I have used the same title as we had in the children's story. And that statue that you're just looking at stands beside St Paul's in London, a very significant Anglican, high Anglican church. And I'm sure Paul Glasbergen won't mind me putting this photo on, because this is a life-size statue of John Wesley. And it actually shows you, are you seeing? Yes, you're seeing more than I'm seeing down here, and that's good. It actually shows you that John Wesley was not a very big man in stature, but huge in heart, huge in accomplishments, and he was a man that we can just put of great faith and great accomplishments. And so that's our direction of what we would like to have a look at this morning. In terms of context of his time, John Wesley, his 18th century. And while sometimes we, and Harold, thank you for passing it on to me, the Reformation tour included the story of John Wesley. In fact, Harold, you're going to appear in several photographs today. The Wesley pilgrimage that we include in our going around England in the Reformation tour, it certainly includes Wesley, even though he is 200 years after what we generally regard as the Protestant Reformation, the 16th century. And England, through earlier individuals, certainly experienced a Reformation in England. And I'm not going back there to go through all that. But what happened after that initial moving towards Reformation, and you recall that it happened by Henry VIII declaring himself as the head of the church. And the Church of England, particularly what we call the High Church of England, did not make much doctrinal change from there. It was more, as time went on, it was more about administration. And church practice in some areas, yes, also changed. And so in the centuries that followed, we find that in England, the concept of the Reformation did extend well beyond what was happening on the continent. Because the English Church of England, it became, I guess, divided between those who wanted to pursue the Reformers' teachings further, and they did it either by doing one of two things. They either were what were called Puritans, which meant that they stayed within the English church and tried to reform the church, or they became dissenters by opposing what was going on in the church, had to step outside and therefore started their own church. So, as we identify John Wesley as the most influential Puritan of English history, how come there's a church lined up behind him? It wasn't his intention. But so while initially he was certainly a Puritan, working within the church, he was a part of the High Church of England in his initial ministry and training. But as time went on, it became obvious that he couldn't keep his approach to what was happening in the church that was following him, the people that were following him, that it couldn't stay within the Church of England, and it separated and became known as the Methodist Church. And we won't be touching on too much of that today, but I'm more interested in the story of Wesley himself. All right, our story begins, as you can see here. There are three places that deal with the childhood of Wesley. The story that I told you this morning, the children's story, comes from about here at a place called Epworth, which was where his father Samuel was also the rector of the Church of England there at Epworth for almost his entire lifetime, for his working lifetime. And from there, both John and Charles, his brother, and Charles is going to get a little bit of a mention today, they end up getting scholarships down in London to attend what we would call public school, boarding school, high school. And so off to London they will go to finish their education that mother had started around the kitchen table for their primary schooling. And then eventually they will go to Oxford for their tertiary training and training for the priesthood in the church. So that's just a little of the background. And the story that I shared with you is an incredible story of not just people who were so grateful for the deliverance of this young lad, the brand plucked from the burning, but it's also a great story of two people, not only Reverend Samuel Wesley, his father, but the mother. You'd have to take your hat off to Susanna. As I mentioned, 19 babies she had altogether, of which 9 survived infancy. An incredible story, and while all that's happening, she's teaching them 6 hours a day as they're rotating through in age. Not only that, 1 hour every night was dedicated to each child, and because of the rotating of the ages moving through, they had a night each. John Wesley's night was Thursday night. Every Thursday night he had one solitary hour with his mother just the two of them. And it really is believed that here at the feet of his mother, John Wesley really became sort of principled in what we would later understand as the teachings of Methodism, or a methodical lifestyle, etc. Because certainly Susanna, as it says in the writings, she raised her children in the atmosphere of piety and Puritan discipline. And that was very true for John. And he looked forward, by the way, to his special hour every week as he spent that time with his mother. But the time eventually came. Oh, by the way, before we go to there, here's the rectory house, and you can see the man in red. That's Harold, just in case you need some clarification. This is the rectory house. After it got burnt down, as I said, 3 times the rectory house was burnt down by locals who were opposing what he stood for. Finally, there was a brick and a safer building was built. You can see it's quite a large home for those days. And this was the rectory house. It's obviously the one that you're looking at now has been restored. But this is the home where the Wesleys lived. And when you go to the home, obviously any home like this that's connected with any story of history and significance, it's turned into a museum, a period museum. And if they can, they gather the specific furnishings as well. And some of these furnishings actually do connect back to Samuel Wesley, interestingly enough. But one of the interesting things I found as we went around the home, most of the detail is about John Wesley rather than Samuel Wesley and Susanna Wesley, both inside and outside. John Wesley is the one who seems to get the focus. Even when you go up to the church that Samuel was a pastor of, there's very little connection inside the church that relates to him and his ministry. The most significant and the thing that the locals love to show you every time you come, this is the baptismal font out of which John and Charles and the other children of Samuel and Susanna were baptised at infancy. And so they will take you to that font. And so again, notice it's John and Charles who are getting the special mention there. Well, we will say that Samuel Wesley does have a recognition as being a tomb site straight outside the church, and later you'll see some significance of that. We'll pass on for now. Well, after John had about the age of 10, maybe 11, we're not exactly certain at which age this was, eventually John wins a scholarship, and he is sent down to the public school, boarding school at Charterhouse in London, not very far from St Paul's, not very far from where later the Wesley Centre will take place there in City Road in London. And that's where he spends, I guess, the equivalent of what we would say his high school years. 3 years later, Charles follows him, being a younger brother, and he's sent this time to Westminster School, obviously near the Westminster Abbey there, and that's where he did his high schooling. And from there, they both graduate and they both head to Oxford at separate times, again, one following behind the other, which was a bit of a practice throughout the lifetime, except when it came to the death of each. Charles did die about a decade, 2 decades almost, before John passed away. All right, so what happens here at Oxford? Oxford is an interesting university city made up of, I think it's 39 or 31, somewhere in the 30s, different separate colleges that make up the university. And it was to this college, Christchurch, that both boys end up coming to be students at to train for the priesthood. And John spends his years here. In fact, it's probably about 6 years he's doing his tertiary studies, probably a bachelorate, probably a master's. I couldn't pick up those details. And from there, eventually, he graduates. Oh, this is an interesting picture I picked up on the internet, actually, where it shows John Wesley was very interested, and you won't be able to read the... maybe you can read the fine print there. It's actually reasonably clear. It shows that John Wesley had a very inquiring mind. And not only did he study for the priesthood and the ministry, but he got involved in, for example, this is an experiment with electricity. He attended an archaeological dig. He visited the British Museum and collected manuscripts and antiques and insects. Believe it or not, he collected insects, or he had some interest in it anyway. He'd be interested in my collection, but I guess he'll never see them. And then he also, as you see on the side here, he writes a book on primitive health. So, you know, John Wesley, he certainly broadened his scope as he was going through Oxford, but finally, as I said, Charles comes to Oxford, and at this stage they continue in a methodical is the word I'm looking for, sorry, in a methodical lifestyle, but they haven't yet started the Holy Club, which we'll hear about in a moment. In fact, John actually graduates from Christchurch. He is ordained as a deacon, and once he is ordained as a deacon, he then moves to a number of different situations. For example, he even is offered a position by his father to assist him in work in a local church, which he did for a very short period of time. And he does other jobs and roles around London and Oxford. But then he is appointed back to Oxford, to this college known as Lincoln College. And we're in the courtyard there in Lincoln College, and you can see over the back here, that's actually a little bronze, oh there it is there, of Wesley, John Wesley, because behind there, in fact not behind, in front of this room here, is what is known as the Wesley Room. And when you go up there, the Wesley Room, it's locked behind glass doors, have never been able to get in, but this was the room in which Charles Wesley, by this stage, who has been a student while John has been out just starting his early work, he is the one who gets the Holy Club started. But when John comes along and is assigned to pastoral work in Oxford, it didn't take very long before he actually took over the role of the Holy Club. So you have pictures like this that appear, the first Methodist, the Holy Club, and it shows that they first began to meet there in 1729, and they continued for about 10 years, as I said, initially under Charles, then John for the stronger period of time of the Holy Club, and then following them another one, George Whitfield. He also becomes very much involved in the Holy Club and becomes a leader when John and Charles both move away from the Oxford area. It continues under the role of Whitfield. Things in John's ministry were not going well. He ministered around London and Oxford, as I said, for a period of time, until it came to him, he felt that he needed to just break out of himself, because he felt he did not have the experience in the heart that this Holy Club was trying to bring everybody to. Their methodical life clearly hadn't hit home in the heart of John, except he had become a legalist. And this was an area of his life that he became very concerned about. And so, eventually, when he was approached to become a missionary to America, he accepted the responsibility and he headed to America with his brother Charles, who by this stage has also finished university and done a little bit of work. And the two brothers by now are sort of catching up with each other, and they became great friends, great mates. They had a lot of common background there at the university. And so Charles comes along with John to Georgia in America to be John's assistant in the church that he will lead. Well, we know the story that on the way, the ship that they were aboard for a couple of months going across the Atlantic to America got into a storm, and John at that stage, and you can read his diary accounts, it's quite incredible actually, but he just records how fearful he felt because of the circumstances of the storm. He feared that he might die. He might, everybody on board might be lost and drowned, and he might die, and he wouldn't be ready to meet his Lord. And he wrote in his diary, "I hope by serving the American Indians, I will find what I'm preaching about." And so eventually he arrives, and by the way, he had some interesting discussions with the Moravians, and I did miss that little part of the story out, because one of the things that contrast his experience was he noticed this group of Moravians, and Moravians were reformers who had come out of Germany from the Reformation and were great as missionaries going across the world into other countries, etc. And there were Moravians on board heading to the United States as well. And he was just amazed how that everybody, not just the men, but the women and children, were just also calm and at peace, sang hymns through this difficult storm, and were not afraid if they had to die. And so that led to a lot of discussion and drew him towards the Moravians. Not only on board ship, but when he got to Georgia, and this is a bit of a fantasised picture which appears on the internet, because you'll see that there's a couple of Indians sitting over here, a row or two of them in church, and it is not likely that the church where John actually served, he actually served them together. In fact, this is a more appropriate picture because it shows them separately, where he did have opportunity to go out and to preach to the Indians, unsuccessfully, and he did preach to the colonists as well there in Georgia, but it wasn't a good time for him. Let me just, I've missed a bit there, this picture here I'd like to, we jumped over this a minute ago. It actually says here that his inclusive ministry sought out to embrace both Native Americans and colonists. So that was his objective, to reach out to both classes, but unfortunately it didn't work. For example, here in the church where he was assigned, when he arrived, he preached a powerful sermon, 1 Corinthians 13, and the people were so moved by it, coming back to hear him preach again and again, that they cancelled the dance that was due to be held in the church hall in 10 days' time. And then he picked up on jewellery. And away he went on that, and now he was starting to lose a bit of clientele. You know, people weren't now so interested in what he was on about. And then where he really started to run foul of his congregation was when one of the ladies of the congregation had had an affair with somebody of high standing, and so he decides that he would, in fact he was invited to go and visit her. And when he arrived, she pulled a gun on him, of which he, very smartly, as a young man, overpowered her, attacked her and overpowered her, for which he pulled out of the other hand some sharp scissors. And in both cases, John overpowered her and was able to walk out of that situation unscathed physically, but it began to dent his reputation because the parishioners didn't want him acting as a cowboy like this in dealing with sins within the congregation. And so before very long, he was really out of favour. The last nail in the coffin was he fell in love. And he actually got engaged. But then some of the Moravians told them a little bit about the background of the lady who had fallen in love with and got engaged to. So he broke the engagement, which apparently was not done in those days. Women were allowed to break the engagement, not the men. So the arrangement was broken. She went on and fell in love with another and married. But before John left America, she took a lawsuit up against him for breaking the engagement. It became so hot, his only escape was to flee America, which he did. That was a successful mission trip, wasn't it? And you can probably appreciate that by the time John arrives back, and it's only about a 2.5-year ministry that he has in America, and it's just, to me, it's amazing because he never went back to America. But it is absolutely amazing that Methodism grew as strong in America as it did in England. But it was through the work of George Wycliffe, the man that we've already mentioned, that became a part of the Holy Club. He was the one who was more involved with the American side of Methodism. All right, so John comes back, and let me just read to you. This is what he's writing. This is on board ship on his way back to London. I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me? Who or what is he that shall deliver me from this evil heart of unbelief? I have a fair summer religion. I show my faith by my works, by staking my all upon it. Oh, who will deliver me from this fear of death? And then on the 1st of February, which I think was the day that he arrived back in England, he again writes this. This then I learned in the ends of the earth, that I am fallen short of the glory of God, that my whole heart is altogether corrupt and abominable, that my own works, my own suffering, my own righteousness are so far from reconciling me to an offended God. I want that faith which enables everyone that has it to cry out, I live not, but Christ lives in me. I want that faith when the Spirit itself bears witness with my spirit that I am the child of God. Good on the American experience to bring John Wesley to that part of his life, because he had to be broken before he could be made, couldn't he? And that's what happened in the time that followed. Let's just move forward now. When he gets back to London, the man he seeks out again is this man, Peter Boller. Am I right in pronouncing his name like that? Boller? Boller? All right, we'll go with Boller. And Peter was a Moravian missionary in London, and he is the one who now is going to lead John step by step to where his heart becomes strangely moved. And the story is told, and probably the best place where the story is told is at the London Museum. We're going to go there. But he tells the story, it's in this, you'll see it in a moment, that in the morning he heads, and this is only about, by the way, just 2 or 3 months after he arrives back in England, and Peter has been working on him, and he tells how he goes to St Paul's in the morning, and there at St Paul's, the text of the day was helpful for him in his spiritual journey. And then around the corner from St Paul's, there is what is known as Aldersgate Street. Now, when I say around the corner, probably a kilometre away. Not very far away, though. There's Aldersgate Street. And there's a plaque, as you can see here, people are looking at and photographing. And the plaque reads that here, at this spot, the building's gone, but it was here, where there once stood a building, where John's heart was, as it says here, he felt his heart strangely warm. It was a Moravian meeting again. Here's how we find out more detail. About 200 metres away from that plaque, there is the Museum of London. Right outside the entrance to the Museum of London is this bronze flame. And it's a flame from the diary of Wesley covering this day. You can see the date there at the top, May 24, 1738. And he talks about how that he starts his devotions off during the day, reading a bit of Greek there, and then he heads off to St Paul's. And here, and this part of it, I'm going to see if I can read this for you. I might have to go this way with this one. He says here, in the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street. And by the way, if you're reading with me, you think I'm reading the F's a bit funny. Old English, some S were written like an F. If you look closely, you'll tell the difference between a genuine F and an SF. But you'll have to just do that little bit of adjustment as you go along. Okay, so he goes to the society in Aldersgate Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ. I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. That was the end of his entry in the diary for that day. This was the conversion date of John Wesley. This was the turning point from him being a legalist to him being saved by faith alone. Let me just move on in the story. Within 3 weeks, now just before even the 3 weeks comes, John from here continued working with the Moravians, who led him on that full path of total commitment to Christ and accepting Christ's gift of grace and forgiveness, and that he is saved through his faith in the grace of Jesus Christ alone for his salvation. John accepted that through the work of the Moravians. And look, I don't know how he can go from that experience to getting the pulpit in this church. This is in the University Church at Oxford, and it's the Church of St Mary's the Virgin. And here, the pulpit down here, where are we? Sorry. Yes, the pulpit down here is the one that's enlarged on this side of the picture. It's a little bit confusing, I'm sorry. But John got the pulpit 3 weeks later, and he preached the Sunday sermon. And all the men of the university came in to hear about this great John Wesley and his conversion story. And at the end of today's sermon, I'm going to give you the essence of that sermon, and you can see the transition that went from Holy Club to a saved sinner, as John Wesley did through that Aldersgate experience. All right? I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on, but I just want to finish off now and deal with a little bit more of what happened with John from that point forward. All right? Things moved fairly quickly, actually. In fact, one of the things, John became, he provoked actually people in that sermon and in other places where he had the opportunity to speak. He provoked them so much, but before very long, the doors of the churches were shut to him and he was not allowed to preach because he was so provocative, so enthusiastic in his preaching that they wouldn't let him preach. In fact, is it on the next slides that come up? No, it's a little bit further down the field. Two things happened actually. One is a movement was afoot, which John led, that the following year they opened this building. It was an old gun or an ammunitions foundry. And about 20 years before, there had been an explosion in the factory, and it had been left and never anything done to it until those who were supportive of John Wesley, they took it up, they renovated it, and this foundry chapel would seat about 1,500 people, 300 if you want to sit them behind the rostrum area as well, but it would seat 1,500 to 1,800 people, and it became the centre of Wesley, or those who followed Wesley, as you can see there, up to the date of 1778, when they shifted location to the city street just around the corner. And so this became an important development because it gave John Wesley and other people who became followers of Wesley, it gave them a place to meet and preach and share. But in addition to that, this man, George Whitefield, who we've already mentioned, he led the Holy Club after Charles, then John, and then George Wycliffe led it. Later he will go to America and be involved in sharing the Methodist movement, as it were, or teachings with the Americans. But he had sort of made a step ahead of them while they were floundering around for a while. And he had become a fairly significant preacher. In fact, Whitefield is regarded probably as a greater preacher than John Wesley was himself. And he got behind John at this time and encouraged him and said, look, if you are being blocked out of the churches, do what I do. Come out into the paddocks, out into the fields and preach to them in the open. And so John, and there's a monument, by the way, that talks about this very thing, how that Wycliffe was the one, and this is near Bristol, and we'll just mention Bristol a little bit later, but this is where there's a monument where it tells the story of how, notice, by the way, the expression, the world is my parish. And you'll see that on a number of occasions with Wesley, but here Wesley began to preach at the invitation, as is described here at Hannamount. It talks, pick it up if you'd like, just for a moment. It says in 1739, he, referring to John Wesley, Whitefield, turned to John Wesley for help. Wesley, a high church Anglican priest, was at first reluctant. He wrote in his journal on Saturday, 31st of March, 1739, so this is the next year after his great conversion. He says, I could scarcely reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching, but just a week later, on Sunday, 8th of April, he records, I preached to 1,500 on the top of Hannamount. Interesting, isn't it? And so Wesley now becomes also a great preacher in the outdoors. It wasn't easy. He was heckled and he had a rough time. He was cast out in many situations. In fact, I would like to read to you some inserts from his diaries for Sundays over a 5-week period. He had begun a preaching itinerary, and he says, here we are in May 5. Now, I don't think it was following the May 5 that we saw here. I think it's a little bit later. And he says, I preached at St Anne's, but was asked not to come back anymore. Sunday afternoon, same day, May 5, preached in St John's. The deacon said, get out and stay out. Next Sunday morning, May 12, I preached at St Jude's. Can't go back there either. Week later, Sunday morning, May 19, preached in somebody else's. I'm not quite sure what he means by Saint somebody else's. The deacons called a special meeting and said I couldn't return. Sunday afternoon, I preached on the street and was kicked out of the street, off the street. Next week, the fourth Sunday, Sunday morning, May 26. This man is persistent, isn't he? He's preached in a meadow, but he was chased out of the meadow as a bull was turned loose during the service. Next week, Sunday, June 2, in the morning, preached on the edge of town, kicked off the highway. Afternoon, Sunday, still June 2, preached in a pasture. 10,000 people came to hear me. And there are records of Wesley where he estimates that sometimes there were as many as 20,000 people gathered in the open air to hear him preach. No microphone. What a man. What a preacher. And what a result that came to England as a result of his preaching. And look, there's just a few pictures here off the internet that show that it wasn't always easy. For example, he even went to his father's church, his own childhood church, and asked to preach there, but they said no way. But just outside, I showed it to you before, notice here outside the side door here, there is the coffin of his father just outside the church door. And so he says, well, you can't stop me preaching on my father's coffin. So he jumps up there and he preaches an outdoor sermon again. So you can see that Wesley didn't have it easy all the time. And certainly, he preached to those in prison, he preached to those in need, and there are many stories attached to this, but we haven't got time to stop with them. In fact, if we look at Wesley's involvement around what we call today the UK, in Wales, right throughout England, throughout Scotland and Ireland, Wesley had nearly a 50-year ministry of being the riding preacher. He went around from town to town, particularly to coal miners would he preach. And he just converted people by the thousands. And it is said of Wesley that if Wesley had not come to England at the time he had come, England would have gone through what France was about to go through, the revolution. But Wesley basically is seen as being the one who saved England from going through a bloody revolution like there was across the Channel. So he's a very powerful man, and there are, as we've located there, three areas of location, headquarters if you like. There's the Wesley Chapel in London. This is just around the corner from that first building that they had built there, the Foundry. And again, there's a statue of Wesley. I love the statement, the world is my parish, there at his feet. And inside, it's a lovely church today inside, beautiful stained glass windows. And look, there's even an idea for us. If we run out of seating, we can build extensions that pop out at the end of each pew. You'd put quite a few extras in a building like this, wouldn't you? And that's what they had. And they have a very small chapel there, which also has some of the Foundry seats from that original building that was built just around the corner. And the organ there is one that Charles Wesley owned at one stage, in which some of the hymns that he wrote the words for and accepted the tunes of others, he would play on this organ. And we sang. And look, I think that's Helen singing there at the front. Sorry about the colour, Helen. It's not true, is it? But anyway, that's there. There's the home right next door to the church where Wesley moved from the Foundry, because above the Foundry was the residence for him there in London as well. And he moved here to this residence also. And one of the things I love is just a more recent thing that has come just outside this home is this little marble tablet that reminds you that across the street in the Bun Hill cemeteries there is the tombstone of Susanna Wesley, the mother of John Wesley. And that's it there. You can actually see it right there. But you can't... We did see it, didn't we, Harold, in 2005 when I went with you there the first time. But they've pegged it off now, and you can only walk straight through the middle and see some of the main tombstones and cemetery spots that are right there beside you, and you can't get to Susanna's, but they have a special one for her. And I thought that was really worthwhile. Another very special place was over in Boston. Bristol. There's another chapel being built here in Wesley's time, and Charles spent much of his ministry here, and many of the hymns of Charles were first sung in this chapel. You see right here through the archway, this is the back way actually, into the, there's the chapel there at the back, and that actually is a stable there, and there's a statue of Wesley, because as we mentioned, he does a lot of riding on his horse. In fact, it is understood that he rode a total of about 250,000 miles on horseback in his ministry visiting around England. Well, I must bring this to an end, but there is another place also not too far away where Wesley has a home centre. It's up in Newcastle on Tyne, and there's a square there that reminds us that in times past Wesley came here, and this is the square reminds us of his first sermon that he preaches, and they developed what was known as the Orphan House that became a Wesleyan centre where he would stay, and it was a place for orphans as well. And unfortunately it's gone today, but the plaque remains there, and that's probably the closest we have today of something that's still active, still going as a Wesley centre there in Newcastle on Tyne. All right, Charles Wesley, can't stop without just mentioning him very quickly. Charles Wesley initially was very much with John over the methodical lifestyle that became a part of Methodism. However, as time went on, he stopped attending the Methodist conferences. He died, as I mentioned to you before, or I could just probably pick up the actual date here. It's it's quite a few years. It's at least a decade, 15 years or so before John Wesley, he dies. And so his role in Methodism towards the end of John's lifetime has diminished. So does, by the way, the other man that we mentioned, George Whitefield, who becomes a very strong preacher. Likewise, his role in Methodism diminishes, even though it became significant over in America. But John Wesley was the one who had a long life. He died at the age of 88, and he almost preached up to the day he died. So he had a long influence, and he had a long revival, and that's a picture there of John Wesley. As I said, on that horseback, he rode some 2,500 miles, it's estimated, in that time. He preached, let me just see if I can pick up the number of sermons he preached. He preached a total of, there it is, 42,000 sermons. He published 233 books, most of which were his sermons. And he saved England, as we said, from the Revolution. And I love this. His rule for Christian living was, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as ever you can. And when John Wesley died, on his deathbed, he quoted Psalms 46, that's Martin Luther's special hymn, you'll know, God is our refuge and strength. He feared not for the future. And at his funeral, it was said that he was a prince and great man had fallen this day in Israel. Scores of memorial services were held throughout England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Papers and magazines published scores of his sermons, and his evangelical influence lives on today. And behind the City Street Chapel in London, there is the memorial to John Wesley, where he was buried it's now about 230 years ago. I said I'd come back to finish with, and this is where I'd like to conclude. My conclusion is to take up that sermon that Wesley preached. I was interested to see what was in the sermon. What was the transition that had taken place in his life? Why was his heart strangely warmed? What new thinking now does he have? And so I searched on the internet till I eventually found it, and it's there available for all. And the sermon is written out in full. His key text was, and let me turn to it, his key text was, it's called Salvation by Faith. It was Ephesians 2, verse 8, for it is by grace you have been saved through your faith. And this is not from yourself, it is the gift of God. That was his key text. And as you read through that sermon, and I'd encourage you to look it up sometime and read it yourself, you'll see this. As you read through that sermon, you can see that he makes very strong evidence that you are not saved by your works, by your methodological life. You are saved by the grace of Jesus Christ alone. However, the interesting thing is also in that sermon, while the rest of the verse wasn't quoted as such, the essence of this was also picked up by John Wesley, which becomes a very important part of the heritage of the Methodist Church, Adventist Church, and where we are today, with some addition and revision on it. Notice this. It says, not only, are you saved by grace through faith, and this is not of yourself, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. That, about a quarter of his sermon was talking about that. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. So Wesley came back in the sermon and he said, while we are saved completely and full by God, we're also saved to do good works. We're also saved to live the methodical life. And I guess for me, as I looked at it, he used terms like, the importance of growing in holiness. I got a bit worried. He used even terms of growing to perfection. And I came back and looked at this, in the context of the whole sermon and his conclusion, and I came away with this view of Wesley's teachings. It becomes a matter of acceptance, yes, of we are saved, we are justified by faith in Jesus Christ alone, but then how we interpret the sanctification that follows is going to depend upon the focus you put on it. And if your focus is on the sanctification process once you are justified, you're going to move back into a movement of works again. But if you move away from that as the focus and focus on the relationship with Jesus Christ and the cleansing, the grace that we have in Jesus Christ, you'll live the methodological life. You'll be more Christ-like, that's for certain, but you don't focus on that and you don't develop a doctrine of perfection, which became, by the way, an interesting difference between him and Charles Wesley in the end with their theologies. And so I would just encourage you in conclusion to realise that men like Wesley have had a great experience in God. When he came to the place where he put apart his own good works, his own self-righteousness, his own good life, when he put that aside and realised that it was in Christ and Christ alone that we receive our ticket for eternal salvation, then it is that I believe that we continue to walk in a life with Christ as we focus on that relationship, and we will live, yes, if you like, a life which gains holiness, but it isn't our holiness. It's Christ's holiness as he lives within. And I would like to suggest to you that, yes, John Wesley was a very small man in stature. He was a great man of accomplishments, a great man of faith, and I believe there are some lessons from his life for us to take as we walk. And as we sing our last hymn, you might like to just follow closely some of the wordings. In fact, realising the time, we shouldn't be singing all verses. Could I encourage the PowerPoint people and the musicians? Can we sing the first and last verse? Sorry, Bob, if you don't mind. If we just can sing the first and last verse of this great, again, Charles Wesley hymn, you can kind of notice the echoes, the overtones sometimes coming through in their hymns, more so in the one we sang before. I don't know if you noticed the third verse of the last hymn, but they still direct us to the one who is our Saviour, and that is Jesus Christ our Lord. Our Father in heaven, as we understand more of the great grace that is given to us through Jesus Christ, that comes as a gift through faith, may it be that our hearts will be strangely warmed, and may it be that your love would live out in our life forever. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.